AMD versus Intel for video editing. Which one's better? Much of the debate between AMD and Intel centered around the gaming benchmarks available from their processors and graphics cards. However, you cannot ignore the fact that selecting the correct processor is as important for the content creator segment. Of course, when it comes to purchasing a CPU for video editing, you have two options, AMD versus Intel. If you do a lot of video editing, which one should you get? Let us investigate. Key takeaways. AMD and Intel have excellent options in their 3, 5, 7, and 9 processor families with integrated graphics to provide impressive video editing performance. In 2022, Intel was able to offer more cores and threads on its processors, such as the Core i9-13900K, with 24 cores and 32 threads, whereas none of the AMD Ryzen 9 processors have more than 16 cores, resulting in slightly inferior video editing benchmarking performance. Processors from AMD. The first thing you should know about AMD processors if you want to use them for video editing is that they may be suited for this job for two reasons. For starters, most of them have enough of L3 cache. Second, their concurrent multi-threading technology is fantastic. However, we shouldn't get too far ahead of ourselves in terms of hyper-threading or simultaneous multi-threading, as they have little to no impact on your video editing process. However, there is no doubting that AMD CPUs have a large number of cores and threads, which can greatly improve the speed of any task, including video editing. Putting a number of cores and threads on a processor is no longer exclusive to AMD, since Intel has done excellent work in this area in recent years. However, there is one area where AMD clearly outperforms the competition for video editors, the L3 cache sector. When compared to Intel's comparable processors, AMD processors often have more L3 cache. Having said that, many regard AMD to be a stronger processor in terms of productivity, but Intel is no slouch, as we'll see as we continue to read. Do you want to edit videos on a large scale? Consider learning more about AMD Ryzen Threadripper in our in-depth comparison of Ryzen 9 versus Threadripper. Processors from Intel. Intel may not provide a lot of L3 cache, but it has other weapons in its arsenal that it can deploy when needed. To begin with, Intel has placed a strong emphasis on threads and cores in recent processor versions. To be more specific, some of the company's 13th generation Core i9 processors, which will be available in 2023, will feature up to 24 cores and 32 threads. In the fourth quarter of 2022, the business will also release a large number of such CPUs. The L3 cache is the only area where Intel appears to struggle or lose against AMD. A 32 MB L3 cache is often found in the fastest processors offered by the manufacturer. Intel CPUs, in other words, may recall less instructions than AMD processors. However, Intel still has something that AMD CPUs can't match: Quick Sync. Intel provides Quick Sync, a dedicated core on the processor that handles decoding and encoding processes. Beating it is difficult, and Quick Sync makes a significant performance difference in video editing software that supports it. Other factors influencing performance. Before we get into the benchmarks that will show us which is better at video editing, it's crucial to note that CPUs aren't completely responsible for how quickly you can edit, encode, and decode videos. There are numerous more factors that play a significant effect. For example, in order for your computer to work faster, you must have adequate RAM installed. Furthermore, the type of RAM you have is important. Of course, DDR4 RAM combined with a new processor will outperform DDR3 RAM combined with the same processor. The existence or lack of a dedicated graphics card will also affect your computer's overall video editing performance. Some CPUs are designed to collaborate with GPUs in order to share workload and provide quicker video encoding and decoding speeds. AMD versus Intel video editing benchmarks. Since we are comparing the two CPU manufacturers based on their video editing capabilities, it only makes sense to examine their benchmarks in one of the most well-known video editing applications, Adobe Premiere Pro. Keeping in mind that everyone has a varied budget to deal with, we separated the benchmarks into three categories: top tier, mid-tier, and low tier. AMD just moved to AM5 sockets, and all of the CPUs we chose for these benchmarks are AM5 compatible. Top tier processors benchmarks. The first two processors that we have picked for the benchmark comparison are among the best ones from both manufacturers, i.e. AMD Ryzen 9 7950X versus Intel Core i9-13900K. Here is a comparison. Both CPUs are from 2022 and have a large number of cores and threads as well as a high TDP rating. Jared's Tech on YouTube provided the benchmark scores. Before we get into the benchmarks, let's look at their testing setup. The scores for both processors are relatively close, with AMD Ryzen 9 7950X scoring 1306 and Intel Core i9 13900K scoring 1304, indicating that there is no superior or worse processor in this test. Want to see how the Intel Core i9-13900K compares to another of Intel's strong CPUs, the Core i9-12900K? This Intel i9-13900K versus i9-12900K comparison would be ideal for learning more.